She was about to pull the plug on her husband, who had been shot 10 times and was clinging to life, when a dog appeared in the room, and everything changed. What happened next defied all logic. What did this animal know that no one else did? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming an emotion that you won't want to miss. The ICU room was eerily quiet. The heart monitor emitted a low, constant beep, almost like a whisper, in sync with the weak breaths of Marcos. The police officer, 35 years old, was on the edge of death. His eyes were shut, his skin pale, as if he had already surpassed the human body's limit. He had taken 10 bullets on a fateful Saturday morning during a drug raid, and most of them had hit fatal areas. The doctor overseeing him didn't hide his frustration, knowing he was in an irreversible state. Raquel, his wife, sat at his bedside, gripping his hand as if trying to transmit some life force through the touch. She knew the situation was hopeless. Her eyes were distant, lost between the void and the chaos of it all. The pain she felt was deeper than any physical wound, an emotional agony that consumed her with every passing second. The man she had spent the last 10 years of her life with was lying there, on the brink of death, and she could do nothing. The doctor entered again, his face serious. He looked worn out, his expression unchanged since the night Marcos had been brought to the hospital. He glanced at Raquel, his gaze heavy, and spoke bluntly. "Raquel, there's nothing more we can do. His condition is irreversible. I understand your pain, but we need to consider the possibility of turning off the machines. He's no longer showing any vital signs, he's just being kept alive by the machine. We don't want to prolong his suffering." Raquel swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on Marcos's lifeless form, unsure of what to do. She knew the situation was hopeless. Her gaze was torn between letting him go or somehow fighting for him, but nothing seemed possible. Her love for Marcos was immense, but reality was telling her he was already lost. But, what if there's still a chance? She asked, her voice breaking. The doctor didn't answer right away. He just looked at her with compassion but without hope. Raquel couldn't accept it. Not now. She knew that no matter what happened, their lives would never be the same. She looked at Marcos's face, the man she dreamed of growing old with, and a crushing pressure formed in her chest. The silence stretched between them as the doctor prepared to give the order. Raquel stood up slowly, her mind filled with one thought: turn off the machines, or wait for a miracle. She raised her hand, ready to press the button to end it, when suddenly, just as Raquel's finger hovered over the button, a faint sound echoed from the hallway, a low, persistent scratching at the door. It was so subtle that, at first, she thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a whimper. A soft, pleading noise. The doctor looked up, surprised, as Raquel turned toward the door. She could feel her heart racing, a sudden rush of anxiety flooding her chest. The hospital was supposed to be quiet at this hour. Visitors had long been sent home, and the sterile halls were usually silent, save for the occasional footsteps of a nurse or doctor. Who could be at the door? She set her hand down on the bed and slowly walked toward the door, her steps hesitant. The doctor followed her, his brow furrowed in confusion. When Raquel opened the door, her eyes widened in disbelief. Standing in the hallway, with its fur matted and dirty from the streets, was a dog. A scruffy, medium-sized creature, its fur a mix of black and brown, with eyes that shone with a strange intensity. The dog stood there, panting softly, as if it had traveled miles just to get there. Raquel blinked. She didn't recognize the dog, but there was something about its presence that made her feel something. She couldn't place it. It was as if the animal knew exactly where it needed to be. The dog took a step forward, its body trembling, and looked up at her with eyes full of urgency. It didn't bark or jump around. It just stood there, almost as if it was waiting for her to do something. Raquel's heart skipped a beat. Could this be a sign? She didn't know why, but her instincts told her to let the animal in. She moved aside and allowed the dog to enter. The doctor stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. He had seen plenty of strange things in his career, but this was new. A dog, showing up in a hospital room, at this critical moment? The dog walked straight past Raquel, heading directly toward Marcos. It stopped beside his bed, sniffing the air around him, its tail wagging slowly. It seemed to sense something, or perhaps, it was trying to understand something. The room was thick with tension, and Raquel could barely breathe as she watched the dog. Then, something remarkable happened. As the dog sat next to Marcos, it let out a soft, mournful whine, like it was trying to get his attention. Raquel felt a shiver run down her spine. The dog's presence wasn't just random, it felt purposeful, like it knew something no one else did. The most unbelievable thing came next. Marcos's fingers twitched. At first, it was so subtle that Raquel thought she had imagined it. But then, it happened again. A slight movement in his hand. The machine that had been showing nothing but a flat line for hours suddenly registered a faint pulse. It wasn't much, but it was something. A flicker of life, so small that it seemed impossible. Raquel gasped, her breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the doctor, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Did you see that?" she whispered, not trusting her own voice. The doctor's face went pale. He stepped forward, staring at the monitor. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the soft breathing of the dog as it sat by Marcos's side. "That's impossible," the doctor muttered under his breath. He looked between the monitor and Marcos, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "This can't be real." The heart rate monitor beeped again, a bit louder now. A sign of life, albeit faint. Raquel's pulse quickened. Could it be? Could this dog really be doing something? It didn't make sense, but the evidence was right there. The doctor's hands shook as he checked the equipment once more, as if expecting to find a mistake in the readings. But there was no mistake. Marcos's heart was beating, ever so slightly, and the pulse was growing stronger. The dog, sensing the change, turned its head toward Raquel, locking eyes with her. Its gaze was steady, almost as if it was telling her to keep fighting. There was something in its eyes, something knowing. Raquel felt a wave of hope surge through her, as though the dog was a beacon in the darkest of times. The doctor stepped back, still stunned, and mumbled. "I don't know what's happening here, but this is beyond anything I've seen." Raquel's hands shook as she reached out to touch Marcos's hand again. The warmth was returning to his skin, ever so slowly. She couldn't explain it. She didn't want to question it. All she knew was that, for the first time in hours, she wasn't alone in the fight. She had to believe it. She had to. She looked at the dog again. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure the dog could understand. But she felt a sense of gratitude she couldn't explain. It was as if the animal had brought a spark of life back into her world, a spark that she had nearly given up on. The doctor, still speechless, turned to leave the room, no longer knowing what to make of the situation. He couldn't explain it, and perhaps he didn't need to. As the night stretched on, the beeping of the heart monitor grew louder and steadier. Marcos's breathing, still labored, became a little stronger. And in the corner of the room, the dog remained, its watchful eyes never leaving the bed. Raquel sank back into her chair, holding onto her husband's hand with renewed strength. Whatever was happening, she knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. As the night passed, the hospital room remained shrouded in an almost surreal stillness. The dog had not left Marcos's side for a single moment, its eyes locked on him with an unwavering intensity. Raquel had never seen an animal act like this, and a part of her wondered if it even understood what it was doing. But the changes in Marcos's condition were undeniable. The beep of the heart monitor had gradually grown stronger, more consistent, as though it were mirroring the pulse that was returning to her husband's body. She hadn't left his side. Neither had the dog. It was now early morning, the first light of dawn filtering through the blinds, casting faint shadows on the walls. Raquel hadn't slept a wink. She sat there, her eyes never leaving the monitor, barely even daring to breathe for fear that any moment the fragile progress they'd seen might vanish. The door to the room creaked open, and Dr. Souza, the lead doctor, entered, his expression a mix of confusion and skepticism. He looked at the monitor, his eyes widening as he saw the steady pulse. This is impossible," he muttered to himself, reaching for the chart to double-check the data. He glanced at Raquel, who looked back at him with a mix of hope and disbelief. "What happened?" Raquel stood up slowly, her voice trembling as she spoke. It's the dog. After it came in, Marcos, he started to wake up. He's responding. You saw it, doctor." He moved his hand, and the heart rate went up. "It's real." Dr. Souza rubbed his forehead, his mind racing to process the impossible scenario. He had seen countless miracles in his career, but none like this. He had never heard of a dog being able to revive a person, much less a man who had been shot 10 times and was declared clinically dead just hours ago. The dog, still sitting at Marcos's side, raised its head slightly at the sound of their voices, its eyes flicking from Raquel to the doctor. For a moment, it seemed as though it was waiting for something. Raquel couldn't shake the feeling that the animal knew more than anyone in the room. Dr. Souza took a cautious step toward Marcos. The room was thick with uncertainty, and yet, in the midst of the chaos, there was a strange calmness in the air. The heart rate monitor beeped steadily now, a hopeful rhythm that had been absent for so long. "This is highly unusual," the doctor said, his voice almost a whisper. "I've never seen anything like it. We need to run more tests, but I'm not going to lie, Raquel, this is beyond medical explanation. You might just be witnessing something extraordinary." Raquel felt the weight of his words sink in. She wasn't sure if she could believe it, but the evidence was in front of her. Marcos was alive. And it wasn't just the machines keeping him that way anymore. Something had changed. But as the doctor prepared to leave to gather more equipment, something shifted in the room. A low growl, soft but unmistakable, emanated from the dog. Raquel froze. She hadn't noticed it before, but now she saw it. There was something off about the dog. Its eyes, which had been soft and hopeful, now glinted with a sharpness she hadn't expected. The animal's posture had subtly changed, as though it was protecting something. Its hackles were raised, and its ears were flattened, as if it sensed something dangerous in the air. Raquel took a step back, instinctively pulling her chair closer to Marcos's bed. She didn't know why, but the dog's sudden aggression unsettled her. It was almost as if it had become territorial. "Is everything okay with the dog?" Raquel asked, her voice low. The doctor glanced at the dog, but his face twisted in confusion. I don't know, Raquel. This is all too strange. It's almost as if the dog is aware of something we can't see. But I've never seen a dog behave like this, not even in the most extreme situations." Before Raquel could respond, the dog let out another low growl, its eyes now fixed on the doorway. And that's when they heard it. A soft creaking sound from the hall. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Raquel's pulse quickened, and she felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. She hadn't heard any footsteps, but there was someone, outside the door. Dr. Souza turned toward the door, a frown furrowing his brow. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm. No one answered. But the scratching sound began again, more frantic this time. Raquel's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped back, instinctively shielding Marcos with her own body, even though he was unconscious. What was going on? The door slowly inched open. And standing in the doorway was another figure. A man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and his features were hidden beneath a hood. The room seemed to grow colder as he stepped inside, his presence overwhelming and almost unnatural. The dog, which had been calm just moments before, now leaped to its feet, its growl escalating into a full-fledged snarl. It stood between Raquel and the man, its body tense, ready to defend her and Marcos at all costs. The stranger didn't flinch. He just stood there, motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the dog. Raquel, her voice trembling, finally found the courage to speak. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man's lips curled into a cold smile, but he didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted to Marcos, then back to the dog. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not here for you, Raquel. I'm here for him." Raquel's breath caught in her throat. The man's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating her thoughts. She had no idea who he was, or why he knew her name. But the way he spoke, it felt deliberate, like he knew something no one else did. Her eyes darted between the stranger and the dog. The animal, still in a protective stance, was growling fiercely, its teeth bared. The dog wasn't backing down. In fact, it seemed more aggressive than before, its eyes never leaving the man's face. Raquel instinctively stepped forward, shielding Marcos even more. "What do you want with my husband?" she demanded, her voice a mixture of fear and defiance. The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements smooth, deliberate. He seemed to be studying her, weighing her reaction. Raquel's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing. Who was this man? And why was he so interested in Marcos? "Your husband," the man began, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if he was speaking to himself more than to her. "He's not just any man, Raquel. You've been living with a lie. A very well-kept lie." Raquel's blood ran cold. A lie? What was he talking about? Was this some kind of twisted game? "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling, but still demanding answers. The man looked at her, and for the first time, his expression softened, just for a moment. "Your husband didn't just get into that firefight by chance, Raquel. Marcos isn't who you think he is." Raquel froze. Her mind went blank for a moment as she tried to process his words. What was he talking about? Marcos was a police officer, a good man. He'd always been by her side. They'd built a life together. How could this stranger stand there and claim that everything she knew was a lie? But before she could say anything, the dog let out a sharp, ear-splitting bark. It leaped forward, its body tensing as if it were about to attack. The man raised his hand, almost as if he were calming the animal with some invisible force. The dog hesitated, its growls turning into soft whines as it stepped back, its body still tense but no longer hostile. Raquel's eyes narrowed. What was going on here? "Stop." The man's voice was firm, and despite its coldness, it had an undeniable command. "I'm not here to hurt you, Raquel. But I can't let you protect him anymore." Raquel felt her heart race, her body tensing. What did he mean by that? She stood her ground, despite the fear curling in her chest. "Don't you dare come any closer," she warned, her voice steady but filled with terror. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a slow, almost pitying smile. "You still don't understand, do you? Marcos isn't just a police officer. He's part of something far bigger, something you couldn't even begin to imagine. You've been kept in the dark all this time. And now, you're too far in to get out." Raquel's head spun. She looked down at Marcos, her husband, lying unconscious on the bed. He had been shot 10 times, he shouldn't have survived. He should have been dead. And yet, against all odds, he was still alive. What was the man implying? What was he trying to say about Marcos? She stepped back from the bed, her eyes still on the stranger, then glanced at the dog, which was now sitting silently beside Marcos, watching the man carefully. It didn't trust him, that much was clear. The dog's presence had felt like a miracle before, but now, with the man in the room, it felt like a warning. The man finally spoke again, his voice dark and foreboding. He's not just a cop, Raquel. Marcos has been a part of a covert operation for years, something classified. What you think you know about him, the man you married, it's all a facade. Raquel's head was spinning. She reached for the bed, gripping it tightly to steady herself. What do you mean? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The man tilted his head, as if considering how much to reveal. Then, with a cold smirk, he said. Marcos wasn't supposed to survive that night. He was supposed to be eliminated. He knew too much. But now that he's alive, everything changes. They'll come for him. And for you, too. Raquel's eyes widened in horror. The blood drained from her face. She looked back at Marcos, her mind racing. Was this true? Was this why he had always been so secretive? Was this why the police had always been watching him so closely, why there had been so many unexplained events in their life together? The man took a step closer, his voice lowering to a chilling whisper. Your husband is not just a victim of a shooting. He's a liability. And the people who were after him, they don't stop until they get what they want. Now that he's awake, the clock is ticking. They'll come for him again. Raquel's legs went weak, and she collapsed back into the chair beside Marcos. The man's words echoed in her mind, the weight of his revelation sinking in. Was it possible? Was everything she knew about Marcos, everything she believed, just a lie? Had she been living in the dark all these years? Then, a strange thing happened. The dog, which had been sitting quietly, suddenly stood up and walked toward the man. For a moment, Raquel thought it was going to attack him, but instead, the dog walked past him, its eyes no longer filled with aggression, but something else. Recognition. The dog sniffed the air around the man for a few seconds, then looked back at Marcos, who was still unconscious. The man let out a soft chuckle, as if he had expected this reaction from the dog. He seemed almost amused by it. He knows too. Raquel's heart raced. Knows what? She demanded, her voice shaking. The man finally turned to leave, his eyes lingering on her one last time. You're in deeper than you realize, Raquel. And now, you have a choice to make. Stay with him, and suffer the consequences. Or walk away, and leave it all behind. With that, the man turned and walked out of the room, leaving Raquel in stunned silence. The dog stayed for a moment longer, looking up at her with those same knowing eyes. Then, as if its purpose was complete, it turned and followed the man out, disappearing into the hallway. Raquel sat frozen, her mind reeling from what had just been said. What did it all mean? And what was she supposed to do now? She looked down at Marcos, the man she thought she knew. Was he really the man she had married? Or was he part of something far darker than she could ever have imagined? The hospital room was eerily quiet after the man left. Raquel sat motionless in the chair beside Marcos, her hands gripping the edge of the bed, her mind still reeling from the cryptic words he had spoken. Her heart was racing, a mixture of fear, confusion, and disbelief swirling inside her. What had just happened? What did that man mean by all his talk of secrets and covert operations? And what was that dog, how was it connected to all of this? She looked at Marcos, still unconscious, his breathing steady but slow. For a moment, she almost wished he would wake up so she could demand answers. But part of her was terrified of what he might say. What if the man had been right? What if everything she had believed about her husband, about their life together, was a lie? Raquel's thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps outside the door. She tensed, her body stiffening, unsure if the man had returned or if something else was happening. She reached for the small button on the side of the bed and pressed it, calling for a nurse. The door opened just a moment later, and Nurse Lucia stepped in, her face neutral but with a hint of concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her gaze flickering from Raquel to the empty space in the room. Raquel opened her mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. The nurse was the first person she had seen since the strange encounter, and right now, the world outside this room felt distant, irrelevant. Only Marcos mattered. Can you explain something to me?" Raquel asked, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong. Something I don't understand." Nurse Lucia's eyes softened, and she approached cautiously, sensing the tension in the air. "What's going on, Raquel? You seem shaken." Raquel hesitated. Could she tell the nurse what had happened? The encounter with the strange man, the dog, the impossible recovery? It sounded insane, even to her own ears. But she couldn't keep it inside any longer. She needed someone to hear her, someone who might be able to make sense of it. "It's about Marcos," Raquel began, her voice low. "I don't know how to explain this, but the man who just came in, he said things about Marcos, things I don't understand. He said Marcos isn't who I think he is. That he's part of something dangerous. That they've been after him, that he wasn't supposed to survive." Nurse Lucia froze for a moment, her eyes widening slightly, then she quickly glanced toward the door as if to make sure no one was listening. "Raquel, you need to be careful," Lucia said in a hushed tone, her voice strained. "There are things you don't know about your husband, things he's never told you. Things none of us know." Raquel's chest tightened. She felt as though the floor was slipping from under her. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Lucia hesitated for a long moment, her eyes flickering nervously. "I can't explain everything, but there are people who have been watching Marcos for years. They think he knows too much, that he's involved in something much bigger than a simple police operation. I don't know exactly what it is, but I've heard things. Things I shouldn't have. I've seen strange men come in and out of this hospital, and they always ask about him." Raquel felt a cold chill run through her. The room suddenly felt much smaller, the air thicker, like something was closing in around her. "Who are these people? What do they want with Marcos?" she asked, barely able to speak through the fear that gripped her. Lucia took a deep breath, and for the first time, Raquel saw the nurse's face flicker with a mix of fear and guilt. "Raquel, I can't say too much, but I've worked here for years. I've seen things. People coming and going, operating in the shadows. Marcos is involved in something bigger, something classified. He's been undercover for a long time, not just with the police. There are forces at play, people who would do anything to protect their secrets. And if Marcos remembers anything from his undercover work, it could mean his life, and yours, are in danger." Raquel's mind was spinning. Undercover? Secrets? What kind of life had Marcos been living without her knowing? Had he been lying to her all these years? She had always trusted him, believed in him with everything she had. How could he keep something so dangerous from her? And then, something clicked in her mind. The dog. Raquel turned sharply toward the door, the pieces falling together in a flash. The dog wasn't just there by coincidence. It had come for a reason. It had been guarding Marcos, protecting him. But who had sent it? And why? Lucia seemed to sense the shift in Raquel's mood. She stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "You have to be careful. Marcos might have been targeted because of what he knows. And now that he's alive, it's only a matter of time before they come for him again. You need to prepare yourself, Raquel. If they find out he's still breathing, they won't hesitate to finish the job. And they'll come after you, too. Raquel felt the weight of Lucia's words pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced, but she couldn't form a single coherent thought. Was she really in danger? Was Marcos's life, and hers, hanging by a thread? Lucia paused and gave her one last look, her expression grim. Don't trust anyone, Raquel. Not even the people you think you can trust. Everyone has a hidden agenda. And with that, Nurse Lucia walked out of the room, leaving Raquel alone with more questions than ever. She turned back to Marcos, her heart heavy with doubt. The man who had been her husband, the man she had loved and trusted with everything, was he really who he seemed? Was he hiding more than just secrets? Was he involved in something dark, dangerous, that she couldn't even begin to understand? Raquel's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Who could she trust? Where could she turn for answers? And then, she heard it again. The faint scratching at the door. The same soft, persistent sound. She didn't hesitate this time. She moved toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. And when she opened it, the dog was standing there once again, waiting. Raquel's heart skipped a beat when she saw the dog standing at the door. Its fur was matted with dirt, and its eyes gleamed with that same knowing intensity. It was as if it had been waiting for her to open the door. For a moment, Raquel stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The dog had returned, after everything that had happened, it had come back. The way it had been by Marcos's side, watching over him, protecting him, it was no coincidence. And now, after Nurse Lucia's warning, Raquel couldn't shake the feeling that the animal was trying to tell her something urgent. She stepped aside, allowing the dog to enter. It didn't hesitate. It walked past her with purpose, heading straight for Marcos's bed, just as it had done before. This time, though, Raquel noticed something different. The dog didn't sit down right away. Instead, it sniffed the air around Marcos, its body tense, as if it could sense something that she couldn't. Raquel closed the door quietly behind her, her mind racing with everything she had learned in the last few hours. Marcos was involved in something dangerous. People were after him, people who would stop at nothing to silence him. And now, it seemed the dog was more than just a witness, it was a key to understanding what had happened. As she moved closer to the bed, her gaze fell on Marcos. His pulse was steady now, the machines no longer displaying that flat line. But his condition was still fragile. He was alive, yes, but for how long? And if the man who had come into the room earlier was right, if Marcos had been part of something much bigger than a police officer, what had he gotten himself into? The dog let out a soft whine, as if sensing Raquel's turmoil. It turned to her, its eyes locking with hers, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a flash of recognition in those eyes. Then, a strange thing happened. Marcos's fingers twitched again. Raquel's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, and this time, she felt the warmth of his skin. He was alive, truly alive. But it wasn't just the machines anymore, there was something more at play here. The dog's presence, its insistence, seemed to have triggered something in him, something she couldn't explain. She stepped back slightly, watching in awe as the dog stood up and walked to the foot of the bed, its eyes never leaving Marcos. It didn't bark, it didn't make a sound, it just stood there, its posture alert, its gaze unwavering. Raquel's mind was racing. The dog had come back, and now it was as if it were waiting for something. But what? Before she could even attempt to make sense of it, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the door. Raquel's heart skipped a beat. She had just begun to feel a sense of hope, but the reality of their situation was sinking in. The people who were after Marcos were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found him. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer. Raquel's pulse quickened, and she turned toward the door, her mind already working overtime. Should she hide? Should she call for help? She glanced at the dog, who was now standing at attention, its ears pricked, watching the door as if it had been expecting this. Then, the door creaked open. Raquel's breath caught in her throat as she saw who was standing there. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a nurse. It was the same man who had come earlier, the one who had warned her that everything was about to change. His dark coat was still wrapped around him, his hood still casting a shadow over his face. But now, there was something different about him. His posture was more controlled, his movements slower, more deliberate. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to act. Raquel's pulse spiked, and the dog reacted immediately. It growled low in its throat, the sound so menacing that it made the air feel heavy. The man didn't flinch. He just stared at the dog, then turned his gaze to Raquel. "I told you that you wouldn't be able to protect him, Raquel," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "You're too far involved now." The moment he woke up, everything changed. Raquel stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to do. The man's presence was suffocating. There was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. This wasn't just a threat. This was something much worse. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "What do you want from Marcos?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I told you. It's not about you, Raquel. It's about him. Your husband has information that people are willing to kill for. And they'll stop at nothing to get it." Raquel's knees felt weak. She glanced back at Marcos, her mind spinning with all the possibilities, none of them good. What had he gotten involved in? What kind of information did he possess that was so dangerous? But before she could react, something unexpected happened. The dog moved again, its body rippling with power as it stood between Raquel and the man. It wasn't growling anymore. It was silent, but there was a clear warning in its stance. The man looked down at the dog, his expression hardening. He stepped forward, but the dog didn't move. It simply stood its ground, staring the man down with an intensity that made Raquel's breath catch in her throat. "Move the dog," the man said, his voice dangerously low. But the dog didn't flinch. It only growled softly, a low rumble that resonated in the silence. Raquel's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that the dog wasn't just protecting Marcos. It was protecting her too. "I told you, you can't protect him, Raquel." The man reached into his coat, his hand moving towards something inside. Raquel's eyes widened. Was he armed? Was he going to? But before he could pull out whatever weapon he was reaching for, the dog lunged. In one swift motion, the dog moved toward the man, its jaws snapping just inches from his face. The man staggered back in surprise, his hand flying up instinctively to defend himself. But the dog didn't stop, it was relentless, its growls echoing through the room. Raquel stood frozen, her eyes wide in disbelief. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain: the dog was protecting them, protecting her and Marcos from something much darker than she had ever imagined. And in that moment, as the man stumbled backward and the dog advanced, Raquel realized the truth. The man hadn't been lying. Marcos wasn't just a police officer. He was a part of something much bigger, something dangerous. And now, the people after him were closing in. The dog lunged forward, its teeth bared, snapping at the man with an intensity that left Raquel breathless. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. The man staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, barely managing to avoid the dog's ferocious attack. The dog wasn't just defending, it was attacking with purpose, a predator set on eliminating the threat in its path. Raquel's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. The man, clearly unprepared for the dog's assault, gripped the doorframe to steady himself. His eyes flickered toward her, filled with contempt, but there was also something else, something deeper. Something cold. "This won't stop us, Raquel," the man said through gritted teeth, his voice low and threatening. "You can't protect him. You can't protect yourself." Raquel's mind was spinning. She knew the man was dangerous, but now, seeing the dog respond so fiercely, it was like everything had shifted. The balance of power, the stakes, the unknowns, everything had changed. But before she could even react, something unexpected happened. The dog stopped. It was as if a signal had been given. The dog stood still, its body tense but unmoving, eyes fixed on the man. It no longer growled or bared its teeth, but there was a warning in the air. The tension was thick, palpable. The dog wasn't retreating. It was waiting for something. Raquel glanced between the dog and the man, both of them locked in a silent standoff. And then she realized, the man was no longer the immediate threat. The real danger was something much bigger. The man, still panting from the surprise of the dog's sudden attack, took a deep breath and straightened up. His expression had changed, from contempt to something else, something almost resigned. Slowly, he reached into his coat again, this time pulling out a small device, no larger than a pager. With a single press of a button, the device emitted a soft beep, and Raquel felt a cold chill sweep through her. The air seemed to tighten, the shadows in the room deepening. It was as if something was about to happen. "You really don't know what's going on, do you?" The man said quietly, his voice now calm, almost pitying. Raquel didn't respond. She couldn't. Every part of her wanted to flee, to run away from all of this madness, but she was paralyzed, caught in the web of lies and secrets that were closing in on her. The man took a step toward her, his eyes now locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "Marcos was never just an officer, Raquel. He's been part of an operation that you couldn't possibly understand. An operation so deeply embedded in the system that even the highest authorities don't know the full scope of it. There's a reason they've kept him alive. A reason they've kept him in the shadows. But now that he's awake, it changes everything." Raquel's head was spinning. What was he talking about? She had always known Marcos to be dedicated, to live by a code. He had never mentioned anything that could be considered covert. He had always been so open with her, so trusting. How could this man be telling the truth? The dog, sensing her inner turmoil, let out a soft whine, stepping closer to Raquel as if to reassure her. Raquel reached down to pet its head, finding comfort in its presence. The dog was more than just a pet, it was a protector. A protector of Marcos, yes, but now it seemed to be protecting her too. It was as if the animal could sense her growing panic and was trying to ground her. But the man wasn't done. "You've heard the stories, right?" he continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "The ones about the disappearances, the unsolved cases, the people who've gone missing without a trace? It's all connected, Raquel. Marcos was sent into something so deep, so dark, that he became part of a shadow war. A war between those who want control and those who want to expose the truth." Raquel's breath caught in her throat. She shook her head, trying to reject the reality he was presenting. "No. No, this can't be true." Her voice was firm, though inside, she was starting to doubt everything she knew. The man smiled faintly, as if he had been expecting her to react this way. "It's true. And now, Raquel, you have to decide what you want to do. Because they'll come for him again. And they won't stop until they get what they want." Raquel's mind raced. What was he talking about? Who were these people he kept referring to? And why had Marcos been put in the middle of it all? Who are they? Who's coming for him? She demanded, stepping toward the man, her voice trembling with urgency. But the man just shook his head. It's not something you can fight. Not something you can understand. There are forces beyond your control at play here, Raquel. You've already seen the signs. Marcos's survival isn't an accident. Neither is the dog. Raquel felt a jolt of realization. The dog. The dog wasn't just some stray, it was part of all of this. Part of the game. A protector, yes. But more than that, it was the key to understanding why Marcos was still alive. And then the man dropped the final bombshell. You think you're the only one watching him? You think this dog is the only one keeping him alive? There's more. There's a whole network of people, Raquel. People who have their hands in everything, from law enforcement to government. People who would go to any lengths to keep their secrets buried. And you and Marcos? You're caught in the middle. Raquel felt the floor beneath her shift. Her entire world was unraveling before her eyes. Marcos wasn't just a police officer caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was part of something much, much bigger. A secret that had been hidden from her, from everyone. And now, with the dog's return and the man's cryptic warnings, Raquel felt like she had been thrust into the middle of a nightmare she could never escape from. The man turned to leave, but before he did, he stopped and glanced back at her one final time. You'll have to decide soon, Raquel. The clock is ticking. And if you don't act, it won't just be your husband who pays the price. With that, he left the room, leaving Raquel standing there, breathless and alone. The dog remained by her side, its eyes alert, as if it were waiting for her next move. Raquel turned toward Marcos, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and betrayal. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She didn't know who to trust. All she knew was that time was running out. And whatever had started with that fateful shooting was far from over. Raquel stood frozen, her mind spinning in the aftermath of the man's departure. The dog, still standing close to Marcos's bed, didn't move. Its eyes were locked on her, almost as if it were waiting for her to decide what came next. She felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. Marcos's life, her life, had been turned upside down in the span of just a few hours. The man's words echoed in her mind, there's more. There's a whole network of people. And you're caught in the middle. The truth was something she didn't want to accept. Marcos, her husband, the man she had known and loved for so long, was a part of something far darker than she had ever imagined. And she had been living in ignorance, blissfully unaware of the web of danger that surrounded him. But now, the truth had been laid bare. And the consequences were more terrifying than she could have ever prepared for. Raquel turned back to the bed, staring at Marcos's still form. His breathing was slow but steady, the steady beep of the heart monitor a faint reminder that he was alive, though barely. For a moment, she thought of the life they had once shared. The quiet nights, the laughter, the shared dreams of a future together. How could it all have been a lie? The dog stepped closer, its nose brushing against her hand as if to remind her that it was there. She knelt down beside Marcos, gently brushing his hair back from his forehead, her heart heavy with uncertainty. He was still alive. But for how long? If the man was telling the truth, and if the people he spoke of were as dangerous as he claimed, Marcos's survival was nothing short of a miracle. Raquel's fingers trembled as they lingered on the side of his face. What if he never woke up? What if she never got the answers she needed? And what if she did? What if she learned everything about the darkness that had surrounded their lives for so long? Could she live with it? Could she continue to love him, knowing the truth? A soft whine broke her thoughts. The dog was now standing next to her, its head tilted, eyes locked on her. It had been by Marcos's side through it all. And somehow, Raquel knew that the dog was more than just a pet, it was a guardian, an agent in this strange, secret world she had been thrust into. She placed her hand on the dog's head, feeling its warmth, trying to find comfort in its presence. Then, the door opened once more. Raquel looked up sharply, her heart racing. Was it the man again? More danger? But when she saw who was standing in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. It was Officer Almeida, one of Marcos's colleagues, someone Raquel had known for years. He was a tall man, well-built, with a stern face that rarely cracked a smile. But now, his expression was grave, his eyes filled with something Raquel couldn't quite place. "Raquel, we need to talk," Almeida said, his voice low, almost cautious. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him as he surveyed the situation. His gaze flickered to the dog, then back to her, before he moved closer to the bed. Raquel stood up slowly, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. She knew Almeida, but there was something in his eyes now that unsettled her. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Almeida hesitated, looking at Marcos's unconscious form before speaking again. "I need you to listen to me, Raquel. This isn't over. What's happening to Marcos, it's bigger than anything we could have imagined. He's tangled up in something that goes far beyond anything the police can handle. And the people who are after him, they won't stop until they get what they want." Raquel's heart pounded in her chest. The truth was becoming clearer now, but it felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. I know they're coming for him." Her voice was barely a whisper. "But what do I do? How do I protect him?" Almeida stepped closer, his eyes dark with urgency. "You can't protect him, Raquel. Not on your own. The people who are involved, what they want from Marcos, it's bigger than us. You have to make a choice." Raquel felt her throat tighten. "A choice? What kind of choice? What are you talking about?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. Almeida took a deep breath, then glanced back toward the door, as if checking for any sign of danger. "I'm not supposed to tell you this. But Marcos has been in deep for years, Raquel. He's been feeding information to a faction of the government. They've been using his position as an officer to infiltrate organized crime, to gather intelligence. But it goes further than that. It's not just about drugs or gangs. It's about corruption. High-level corruption." Raquel's mind raced. This was worse than she had imagined. Marcos had been working for the government, yes, but this was something else entirely. How much had he been hiding from her? How much had she never known? "What do you mean corruption? What are you saying?" Her voice was a mixture of disbelief and fear. Almeida looked around the room once more, then lowered his voice even further, as if sharing a forbidden secret. "There's a hidden faction inside the government. Powerful people who are pulling the strings. They don't want their crimes exposed. Marcos was getting too close to the truth. That's why he was targeted. And that's why they'll come for him again. But Raquel, you don't have to stay in this." Raquel's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Almeida's eyes softened, just for a moment. "If you walk away now, if you leave him, you can disappear. They'll let you go. You won't be in danger anymore. But if you stay, if you keep fighting for him, you'll be pulled into something you can never escape." Raquel felt the weight of his words crush her. What choice did she have? If she walked away, she could save herself. But could she live with the guilt? Could she live knowing she abandoned the man she loved? She turned toward the bed, looking down at Marcos. His survival had been a miracle, yes. But it was only a temporary one. The people after him weren't going to stop. They would come again and again until they got what they wanted. And now, she had to decide, stay, and fight for him, knowing it could destroy them both, or leave, and protect herself from the darkness that surrounded him. Raquel's heart pounded. She looked at the dog one last time. The animal's eyes were steady, unwavering. It wasn't just there to protect Marcos. It was there to protect her, too. And just as the man had said, the clock was ticking. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.